and then we'll trim stuff eventually. But you can set everything up the way that you want. All that. You can minimize. That bar where it is, or do you want
this bar? Maybe move it.
that?
Yeah, that's right.
Grab my little dough.
Yes, in case we have just the volume of the master volume there. Okay. So while you are talking, because we didn't have any proper feedback because it was too loud.
Yeah.
So while you start talking and people will begin to make some sounds.
Yeah.
We
So
have-
I just forget.
I don't know whether the person want to introduce. That's what we have in some variant.
No one's lurking around. They all work.
Should we start? Should we start? Okay, so they can have questions. Yes. Do we have the But if they have questions, all right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to the opening plenary session. Maybe I'll try to do like this. Okay. It's a great honor for me to welcome Zoltán Dianes, a descendant of Hungarians, but Australian British professor from the University of Sussex. He is a great champion of statistic methodology and open science, and he will give us a presentation, after which there will be opportunity for questions. I have to tell you that only Zoltán will be recorded, but anyone asking question will be on the record because the session is recorded. Okay, thank you. Please give a warm welcome to Zoltán.
Can you hear me okay? Yes, great. So I understand you're people of action. This is what I was told. And of the many things one could do in open science, I just do some things, and there's lots of things I don't do. But what I thought I'd do, since you invited me, is tell you some of the things that I do. You could say some of the things I reformed my science in the past several years, which I think you might be interested in, because maybe you could do something like that, or at least for some of them, you might think, oh yes, I could do that. Here we go. Now, a lot of the time when one realizes things could be done better, you can make the decision to make a change. I'll give you some examples like that. But often when you do that, you know, that just you doing that in itself would seem to make an imperceptible difference to how things are done. So I just want to tell a story from the philosopher Derek Parfit about the benefits of imperceptible changes. A torturer can turn a dial from 0 to 1, thereby inflicting unimaginable suffering on one victim. 1,000 torturers each torture one of 1,000 victims by this method. The torturers feel bad about this, so management arranges that torturer number 1 only turns the knob up 1/1000th for each of the 1,000 victims. None of the victims notice any increase in suffering. Torturer 2 increases the knob by a further 1/1000th for each victim, and none of the victims can notice the increase in suffering. But by the time all 1,000 torturers have done their job, all victims have suffered immeasurably, and the confessions have been obtained. Each torturer goes home with what they think is a clear conscience. So Parfit's moral is that causing even an imperceptible increase in suffering is wrong, when you could be part of a group that in total has a large impact. So every time we use a system in a counterproductive way, in other words, we do it just because everyone's doing it, even if because you join in, that's imperceptible, we have done wrong, perhaps enormous wrong. But let me turn that around for doing imperceptible good as well. Every time you do something good for open science, even if the effect is imperceptible, you've done an enormous good. So let me think of some things that individually we could each do. Might be imperceptible, but it will add up. Now, one of the problems we have in science is the publishing system. So we write the papers, we review the papers, we edit the papers. We hand over vast sums of money, which is taxpayers' money, charity money, and student fees that could have gone on research and education. We hand it to the publishers, have a 40% profit margin up to, for jacuzzis and whatever else they want. Just like this guy here who sold refrigerators to Eskimos. Hail King Harrison, king of the salespersons. I think he did a job well when it came to us. And I think it's also wrong that when you have something like Nature where you pay $10,000 APCs, you're essentially creating a rich person's club. Or if you belong to a rich institution who's done a deal with Nature. And that violates the fundamental, that undermines the fundamental principle of science, that anyone should be able to contribute depending only on the quality of their contribution, not how rich they are. And yet we all sustain the system by the imperceptible small actions that we do in supporting it, because it's in our own personal interests. So I made a decision 2 years ago that I do not review, author, nor edit for any journal run by a for-profit, unless some of that money goes to an academic society. So at least there's some trickle down, so it's not entirely evil. And for me, as a cognitive psychologist, that actually leaves quite a lot of journals. There's APA, APS, Psychonomics, lots of non-for-profits, Collabora, and so on. So I'm perfectly happy doing that. But I'm also a professor. I've got a job for life. Do I really care? Publication in Nature or whatever. I frankly don't even care about that. Not anymore. But I know that's different for a lot of you. And there have been, so I'm not saying, I'm just telling you what I'm doing there, and then that's a personal decision, and what you do, it could just be, but if it's just something, a little bit, then it makes a difference, doesn't it? If lots of people just made a little decision, something along those lines. an easy decision to make that won't affect your career is just not review for profit. There was a movement to do this for Elsevier, but Elsevier is just, you know, yes, it's evil, but it's part of a whole system. Yeah, I know in Nature there's these people doing good, and other journals, people doing good stuff for open science, and they're really nice people, but they're part of a system that's highly dysfunctional for science. You could just not review for them. Or you could not cite them so much. Let's say there's a paper in Nature and a paper in Collabora that make pretty much the same point that you want to refer to. We'll go for the Collabora paper. Don't cite the Nature one. Because that's how they build their reputation, because everyone's like, oh, it's Nature, I'll cite it. So that's the first action you might think about. Another thing to do is to support alternative publishing models. And so one is, in fact, when I became set up, co-founded a peer community and registered reports, that when that was up and running, so that there was a publishing model already running that was completely ethical from the point of view of the issues I've just been talking about. That's when I made the decision I just told you, that I do not edit, review, or author for any journal that's run by for-profit, unless it's a society journal. But I did that once I was part of a sort of publishing platform that showed how it could be done otherwise. It's perfectly possible to do it otherwise. So peer community it was set up by biologists, and it's a set of communities. In the communities you can think of as journals. Each of these communities is a journal. It's supported by, originally it was supported by a few French universities and Max Planck. Now there's about 150 universities that give it some money, just small and tiny amounts of money. Let me tell you the figures involved. When we set up peer community and registered reports, yes, because we needed registered reports needs a particular workflow. It's not like a normal journal workflow because of the back and forth in different ways at different stages of the publication. So we needed to spend 50,000 euros with a programmer to get our bespoke system working, starting up. But then after that, what are the running costs? It's 300 euros per year per community. By community, remember, that's per journal. For a whole journal, for a year, 300 euros. That's not an article processing charge. That's the whole journal for a year, it's 300 euros. That's what it takes to cover the costs in the bespoke system to get the job done. So we're not using things like editorial software like ScholarOne, which is a fixed fee per year, $45 per submission. That mounts up enormously. And if we wanted to do registered reports with that, they'd charge us a fortune to change the workflow in it using these company systems. So how does it work? In peer community and registered reports, I'll take as an example, which we set up in 2001, about 2 years ago now, a bit over 2 years. You as an author would put up your stage 1 manuscript in an archive. You then log into our system and give the link to your paper, and then we go through the process of editing and reviewing it, just as would happen in a journal. But we have the editors who are sort of the best editors in registered reports, Chris Chambers, all of the editorial team of Cortex, registered reports, Cortex, all of the registered reports editorial team of Royal Society Open Science, plus others. Those are the people we started this off with. So these are the people who are doing the editing for the journals. So you can't say the quality of the editing is any worse than the journals. You can't say that because we're on the same boards. Then we go through the process, we take it through to stage 2. The trick here, because I wasn't sure this would take off, because what academics need for promotion is prestige publications. So even Professor Fenwick, what he ever really wanted was recognition. So please welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Melvin Fenwick, the man who back in 1952 first coined the now common phrase, "Fools, I'll destroy them all." So how do we crack that one? When you say have an archive-based reviewing system, which has been tried, why doesn't it, where does the prestige come from in this? Well, so far we've had 69 stage ones accepted, in principle acceptance, 22 stage twos, and because the submissions keep coming in so rapidly, we've had to increase our editorial pool, we call them recommenders, and now they're over 70. And we're still increasing that to handle the submissions that are coming in. And why does that work? Because what we've approved are articles that are on archives, so we haven't published them. We've done all the work, but what our open review comments and open editorial comments throughout the process refer to is we're linking to an archived paper. That means the paper is free to be published by any of the standard journals. So we have 29 what we call friendly journals, which means they guarantee they'll publish any paper that we've accepted without further reviewing, so long as we've satisfied very specific criteria of the journal, like, you know, might want a power of 80% for a significance level of 2% or whatever their criteria is. But they specify that enough detail that we, a peer community, and make that decision whether it's acceptable for that journal or not the journal. But this is where we get the prestige from, because we acquire the prestige of the journals that we feed into. You have to pay APCs if you want to go to the journal. But eventually there'll come a point where people will say, why, the work's already been done, why do I want to pay a few $1,000s to get published in so-so journal when nothing more happens to it? But I think that illustrates the way the publishers are parasites. Because what do you gain? Nothing. Once prestige has rubbed off, as it were, the peer community, and that's it, it's job done, and probably game over in the long run. Now, peer community is a set of communities where you can set up your own community as a team. And the way to make this work, I suggest, is as we did with registered reports, is you get a team of editors, what we call recommenders, who are top people and already top editors in relevant journals. And then get those journals to be friendly journals for your community. And then it works, because then people submit to you, because you then become the way in to get to that journal. Why not just submit to that journal in the first place? Because you have choice. Once you've been accepted by peer community in, you have a choice. You choose which journal you're going to go in. Why would a journal do this? Well, they do. And one thing it does, it can give them free papers without doing any extra work themselves. Or it can give a journal that doesn't do registered reports the capacity to do registered reports. That can be useful for them. Now, what I'd like to see, so what we have is, you can look on the peer community in, you look on the peer community in site and you can see the list of communities. They're largely biology. There's not really psychology there, except for registered reports. And in peer community registered reports, we do any scientific subject and even non-scientific ones where you could do a registered report. But I'd like to do that for my standard area of psychology. I'd like to have that system available to me. Say cognitive psychology, consciousness work, which I do, meta-science. So a good thing to do at some point would be to someone to set up communities of, set up community in your area. And then with enough communities like this, eventually you undermine the publishing model, as we now have, which we all agree is completely dysfunctional. And I'd like to say that peer community registered reports is several steps ahead of any other journal in terms of what we do in terms of registered reports. So we allow registered reports where you have several, a single stage 1 can give you several stage 2s. We do scheduled review where the author says in 6 weeks' time, at a certain date, you say the date, I guarantee I'm going to get you the first draft of the paper. You also send in just a little 1-page summary of what your study's about. We send that summary around to reviewers and say, would you guarantee in a 5-day window after receiving the stage 1, you will definitely review it? Reviewers say, oh, 6 weeks off. Sure, I'll have the time then, and they agree. Well, you have to ask, lots, just as you do in any case, but you get enough people agreeing. And then what happens is the authors submit 6 weeks later when they say they will. We send it out and we do get the reviews back in 5 days. That massively speeds up the whole review process. I mean, after that, it takes a normal length of time. But that massively speeds up the process. You don't get that in any journal. So now, I don't know if you've ever submitted a registered report. I would seriously think about it because that's a big part of open science and it forces you to think in a certain way. Because I've been involved in registered reports since we set up in 2013, the first registered report editorial board in Cortex. And I've been editing registered reports ever since then. I think it's transformed the way I view psychology and science simply by going through that process of a registered report that forces you to think in a certain way, in a certain rigorous way. So I think it's extremely helpful to just how you think about science and psychology to go through the process. So it's sort of, in other words, it's helpful to you self-development as well as getting out rigorous research. So I have a policy with when I get a PhD student, in the first year, we'll have a registered report. We'll submit a stage 1. While that's taking us time to go through, we can do some other studies which aren't registered reports, but at least there'll be one registered report in that PhD. So that's my policy. Now, when I sort of listen to people talk about the science that they do, so just changing tack slightly, but in fact, it's very much related to what I'm talking about registered reports and the way of thinking you get when you do registered reports. This is sort of conversation you might hear. Someone says maybe, oh, that's really interesting. Have you ever thought about manipulating this variable? And the other person says, oh yeah, that would be interesting. And they go off and manipulate that variable and spin some story about it. And that's all very interesting. And there's something to, there's something to natural history. Science does need natural history. You just go out and explore and poke around and you see what happens. And I don't know if this is just a sort of a personal feeling, but I always feel intensely dissatisfied. Just something inside me, just when I come across that sort of science, I sort of shrug a little bit inwardly. There's sort of prejudice. It might be because I read Popper when I was 16. And I'm sort of curious how other people think about these things, because I think there's sort of a bit of a divide where some people genuinely think what science is about is just going out and exploring. You poke around, prod around a bit, and then you tell a story about what you get. fMRI is full of that. But what I think to me is, on the one hand, to me, it just seems more interesting, because what is interesting, what brought me into science, what made me interested in science, but also I think is how we would learn most out of nature, is when you have some hypothesis you're testing, and anytime you do a hypothesis test, right, you're testing a hypothesis. Why not just think, what's the most general interesting theory that could be shown wrong, or that these results could count against when I do this test? In other words, you're not trying to stick as closely to the data as possible and have a theory about the psychology undergraduates in this university at this time. Yeah, if you're sticking close to the data, that's what you're going to say. But that's not interesting, is it? That's not how we're going to find out about the human mind. We're going to make a general claim, make it as general as possible, and then we're going to see if we can set up a test that falsifies it, or at least counts against it. So maybe that's a sort of a personal view, but that's how I think about things. That's what I think what's the most general claim here that could be shown wrong? And can I think of, you know, something really interesting we could say? And then how can I test it severely? Now, whatever you think about that, and however far you go down that path, even if you're just testing a very narrow sort of local hypothesis, you can only test it in any real sense if you've got grounds for finding it wrong. So you should have good grounds for asserting no effect. So this remains, I mean, this is one of the issues that was talked about, you know, when the sort of open science movement first came about. But I think it remains a huge problem sort of in almost every paper I read, even now. I was thinking maybe one reason for that is, I think this is a common view of how statistics and theory interrelate. Function of statistics to say what effects do and do not exist. We detect effects. We say there is this effect and there is not effect, that effect. And then one considers that pattern and considers what it means for theory. So there's the statistics and there's the theory. So that way of doing things, the way you relate science to statistics, which you could call the pragmatics of statistics, is really something very simple. But I think it's actually something fairly difficult, in a sense. Well, it's more difficult than people think it is, and it involves more intellectual work and thinking than people actually do. Almost everyone, Bayesian or otherwise. And the reason I say that is one of the things that that I think about is in many of my papers, is the notion that one can only say there was evidence against something being there if there was a theory of what could have been there. In other words, you can't simply go around detecting effects in the absence of theory in scientific context. Put another way, you can only say there wasn't a signal in that noise if you knew how big that signal could have been. Otherwise, there's no way of saying that. You need some idea of how big the signal could have been, and answering that question is a question that's specific to each scientific problem and each paradigm. And you cannot solve it with standardized effect sizes. The reason why you can't solve with standardized effect sizes is a standardized effect size, a by subject standardized effect size, is sensitive to things which are irrelevant to theories, the theories you wish to test. It's sensitive to things like how many questions are in your questionnaire, how many trials are in your reaction time study. So there's no such thing as a minimally interesting standardized effect size. That doesn't exist. There's only minimally interesting or interesting raw effect sizes. But as soon as you think about raw effect sizes, you have to think about your scientific context. And that means there's a real issue in terms of the pragmatics of statistics, making that connection between your theory and statistics. And there's several ways you can solve this problem. You can do power, equivalence testing, Bayes factors. Now, the aim of power is to control the long-term risk of missing an effect of interest. But that means power should be calculated with respect to any effect that could be of interest. That means, logically speaking, if you're in the business of testing the theory that you wish to test, you have to specify the minimally interesting effect size for that theory. That's not what people do. But it's logically what you have to do if you want to make sure you're not missing out on the interesting effect sizes that are relevant to your theory. And that claim is clearly true. You need a scientifically justified minimally interesting effect size if you do something like equivalence testing, inference by intervals. Because if you're saying, what you're doing here is you define a null region, and you say anything within that region is of no scientific interest for this problem. Then you say, is the confidence or credibility interval inside that region or outside that region? And then you draw your conclusion about whether there's an interesting effect there or not. Well, that conclusion depends entirely on what you define as a minimally interesting effect. So if that conclusion is to be of any relevance to your theory, it must be theoretically motivated. Now, Bayes factors are not so much sensitive to the minimally interesting effect as the actual predicted effect, the roughly expected effect size. So the way I do Bayes, or I do equivalence testing, sort of what I think of as sort of my contribution to this debate is thinking about what are the ways one can think about, given a scientific problem, how do we get this minimally interesting effect size or this predicted effect size because people aren't used to thinking that way. They want to go back to this and say, let's bypass that problem because it requires actually thinking about what my theory predicts. And I don't want to think about that. And anyway, everyone else is just saying a standardized effect size of blah, blah, blah. So I find there's a good logic to both, any of these have their own logic. I find specifying minimally interesting effect sizes is the most subjective aspect of the prediction of the theory normally. Some cases, maybe some clinical cases not, but normally it is. So that's one way reason I'm practically drawn to Bayes factors, and I think Bayes factors are very good severely testing theories. So fulfilling that role that I started with when I started talking about this. So the action, should you wish to pursue this one, is whenever you're hypothesis testing, in other words, doing any of these methods, hypothesis testing with power, inference by intervals or Bayes factors, ensure there's a scientifically justified effect of interest. So there are grounds for asserting no effect that's relevant to your theory. So this is a paper in Calabria where I give some ideas, some heuristics for how to think about this. Now, I think it turns out, although I say it's difficult, it turns out to be more simple than you think. When you first come to thinking about this problem, it seems extremely difficult. But you realize that there's some heuristics you can use that really help things. Now to turn to institutional level actions. So actions that are relevant to a whole institution. I suggested to our research culture committee, University of Sussex, why don't we hire a reproducibility statistician? They had some money to spend to enhance research culture. That was the remit of the money given the university. So I said, okay. And since January of this year, we've had Rennie Bakeover doing this. Anybody in the University of Sussex psychology, when they have a paper to submit, they can, if they choose, send it to Rennie. Rennie looks at the results section and the links to the publicly available data and the metafiles that describe it. And she attempts to reproduce every statistic, figure, and table in that paper. If she can't do it, she gets back to the authors. Now, this is more difficult than people originally think. But so it's a training, so it's a self-development also for the authors. They learn what does it mean to have open data. I mean, really open data that anybody can, an independent person, not part of your research team, can look at and use. That takes some training. Right? And she trains them and gets them thinking about what are the platforms they're using for doing the statistics. They'll make it maximally reproducible for as long as possible. She also, if she comes across problems, she gets back to them and they go back back and forth until she can write a report certifying the reproducibility of the results in this paper. Now, it's not a job to say your statistics are wrong, you should have done it this way and so on. That's not a job. She does write a separate document where she has thoughts about that. And then she says to the authors, do you want to read my other document? At least one set of authors said, no, thank you very much. Which did surprise me, but fair enough. Her job is to be a reproducibility statistician. But she can also tell you, did you follow your pre-registered protocol? Which I think would be very useful for people. She also tell them other things about the stats. But what she will go back and forth with them is this reproducible? Now, what does the author get out of this? I didn't know if people would take us up on this. They have to wait maybe a couple of months while some other person trawls through their work looking for mistakes, delaying their publication. But Rennie's got a backlog of papers. So I'm glad about that. So I've asked for it to be extended. I've got a year's worth of money part-time. I've asked her to be extended another 6 months full-time. And then when that happens, I'll get feedback on the process and say to our dean, we should have this as a permanent post in the school. Now, what the author gets out of this is I can say in the abstract, the results of this paper have been certified as computationally reproducible by an independent statistician. Now, I'm willing to bet that that could boost the chances of getting past triage in a prestige journal. That's what the author gets out of it. What does the dean get out of it? Well, if these authors get out more publications in prestige journals, that's something the dean gets out of it. Now, if you're in the UK and you're going through the REF system, this next coming REF is going to look for open science a lot more. If you can say in your environment statement, we have a reproducibility statistician, up goes your environment statement. In comes more money from the next REF. I think you can sell this to the dean. So action, tell your dean you want one. Now, all of these things, registered reports is a way of getting around human bias, reproducibility checking, it's just recognizing that scientists are human. When she spots things on reproducibility, we don't blame anyone. Of course, we're going to find things that don't reproduce. We're just humans. This is just a check to catch some mistakes that are inevitably going to happen. Now, a broader part of that is university governance. So here's some claims that you might find plausible. The credibility crisis may have arisen in part because of how universities are governed. In particular, there's this thing called managerialism, which is when managers attempt to assess the worth of researchers or whether they achieve certain key performance indicators, which typically mean publication in certain journals and pulling in grant income. And yet research has shown that if you look at methodological rigor, that is at best zero correlated with the journal impact factor and often negatively correlated. Past journal impact factor about 2 or 3. And Smaldino and McIlwraith ran these sort of interesting simulations when it comes to grants, that if you had a community of people with getting in grant money, those people who could p-hack more, and those labs that p-hack more and therefore can sell themselves more to grant panels will get more grant money, and they'll therefore train the next generation of PhD students, and so we have a natural selection system for a bunch of p-hacking salespeople. So I think that's what happens when you run universities the way we run them. You're motivating both of these ways, journal impact factor and grants. You're possibly motivating poor quality research. I don't know if you know about the rat tails of Hanoi. So at the end of the French colonial era in Hanoi, there were too many rats around. So the French said, to help get rid of the rats, for every rat tail any of you guys can bring us, we'll give you a reward. But the amount of rats increased because the local Vietnamese, being resourceful, set up rat farms. My fear is the way universities are governed now, we're basically producing rat farms. And there's something else. Science makes decisions a certain way, which is democratic. Science doesn't operate by a hierarchical top-down control where you obey, yes, sir, the person above you, and you do as you say and you don't question them. That is not how science works. Science works by a democratic process of deliberation, where anyone can contribute in principle, ideally. I know it's not exactly true. But to the extent that science works, I believe it's to the extent to which it matches the ideal, even though it doesn't achieve it, of people being able to engage in critical, open discussion, where critical views are not just tolerated, but welcomed. You read Twitter, you might disagree with that, but that, I think, are the failings of science. That's not why science works. Twitter isn't why science works. Now, science has been one of our most fantastic cultural achievements. I think that's because it's a decision-making process that maximally integrates information. Now, there are ways of running governance where you do have democratic deliberation as the fundamental principle by the way the system is run. In the citizens' assemblies, you may have heard of. That's just the name of a larger group of what are called mini-publics, which the deliberative poll is sort of the most sort of systematically investigated and rigorous, which you randomly select from a population of interest, say 200, 300 people. You put them into groups of 15. You get them to debate some issue. And you give them an information pack provided by each side of the debate. You have a moderator that tries to make sure that no one dominates the discussion. Discussion focuses on arguments per se, not on insults and so on. So you get just randomly selected people from the community. Say there was a township in China, Zhegor township. The council wanted to know how to spend this money. So it had 30 possibilities, randomly selected about 300 people from Zhegor township. They set up a deliberative poll like this, they debated it, and came to conclusions about how the council should spend the money. The council was somewhat surprised. The council thought maybe a big town square to have some town pride would be, you know, a goer. Well, the people wanted things like sewage works, a park to take the kids to, so on. The council then did what the deliberative poll came up with, and everyone was happy with it. So that's the example of the process. You don't have a boss saying what to do. You don't have a set of elites saying what to do. You randomly select from the relevant people, and they form a group and debate, and then they come to a conclusion. So in this paper, I say how a whole university could completely govern from top to bottom. We could get rid of senior management. And we could have an open democracy, just as there was in classical Athens, that ran for about 200 years. And in that classical Greek world, the democracies that ran by principles of open democracy outcompeted the top-down styles of city governance, like oligarchies and tyrannies. Outcompeted in the sense economically and culturally. 200 years Athens was like that. This is a complicated city-state, going to many wars, life and death decisions made all the time, and it functioned, you know, better than the competitors. Other things held equal. Slaves held equal. Sexual inequality held equal. What were the differences? Open democracy versus top-down hierarchy. I think about that when people think, oh, no, you couldn't really do that. Couldn't really run Sussex University like that. Well, let's start with a small little experiment. Let's do a citizens' assembly. So I said to the VC, I emailed the VC and sent her a link to this paper. And I was surprised she emailed back and said, let's talk about it. That looks really interesting. So I've got a coffee with her coming up. And I'll just say, think of some institutional level decision you would be willing to give up to a citizens' assembly or a randomly selected group of the citizenship of the university. And when that works, which I think if you do it well, it will work, it'll increase morale, increase engagement, increase people's sense that they're a community. You take another short step in that direction. Until the way science is governed follows the same principles of maximally integrating information across all relevant sources as the way science itself functions. And I think science itself will then benefit from that, because when you place science in a wider cultural context that matches the processes of science, science seems to do better. Science has always flourished best in democracies rather than authoritarian regimes, for example. So, to put that simply, ask management to hand an important institutional level decision over to a citizens' assembly. I'll call it citizens' assembly because people know that, but similar sort of mini-pub. All right, those are the end of my actions. I just want to say one more thing. There's this paper by the Flourishing Science think tank where they take basic values of how people as a group, any group, could get on: kindness, compassion, joy in other people's joy, impartiality, equanimity. those values suitably extended become the core values of science, I think. In other words, science at its core, open science, which is openness is about impartiality, for example. It's about teamwork, collegiality. It's about helping each other. It's not keeping your things to yourself, saying, no, you can build on what I've done. Those are the same values of how people get on with each other in any endeavor. So the values of open science aren't really the values of shaming other people. Shaming might happen now and again, but open science can get a bad name if you think that that's what it's about. But I think that core science, open science, is not about that. So those are just some thoughts, some of the actions I've done, which I may trigger some thoughts in you, particularly early career researchers, and particularly early career researchers, because if you start making these imperceptible changes, each of you, maybe in 10 years' time, you can say, this is our house, we built it. Thank you. Any questions?
I missed some people here, perhaps.
Thank you so much. That was super inspiring. I have two questions about your first point of action about not reviewing for for-profit journals. Which it's love to hear your take on that. Because will you also say don't submit to those journals? Because if you submit to one of those journals, it's not have to review it. Encouraging.
Well, yeah. So the logical extension of it is you come to the policy that I have, but I'm just saying you don't have to start there. Yeah. But if enough people don't review, yeah, that'll be it for them, won't it?
And the second question related to this, which I find difficult because I also sort of promise myself not to review for these journals, but then I get an abstract or a paper that's just terrible, and I feel I do a figured service to science rejecting this paper for this journal.
Yeah.
The issues of reviewing for a journal.
Yes. I mean, I've been in that situation where maybe there's some paper which I think is just awful from beginning to end, and it's attacking my own work. But because I made a public commitment, see, that was the thing. It's on my website. I do not review, author, or edit for profit journals unless they're society journals. So that's it. I just say, okay, it's crap, but that's the way it goes. And so what I say to myself is, in the long run, people will be able to evaluate that. Well, that's what I hope. I know it doesn't always work that way, but that's what I rely on. I mean, I take readers to be intelligent reasoners.
I'll try to speak up. So referring this point on the slides and addressing, in particular, early career researchers. I hear this a lot. I'd be okay with it, but I think it is important to note that you don't have to be an early career researcher to have to do good science. I mean, do we really want another 20, 30 years of what we see now?
No.
So maybe you can clarify that, because lots of times open science is only pushed and expected from early career researchers.
Yeah.
But then we have selection for p-hacking. So
yeah. Yes. No, the reason why, because that's what I say. I do this, and people say, "What about the early career researchers?"
What about you people with tenure?
Yeah. Well, you see, the argument they should be doing it even more. That's right. I mean, we should all be doing it, exactly. Yeah. But it's especially corrupting people when they're young that's important, I think.
No.
Yeah.
And giving them jobs.
And then giving them jobs. Exactly. Now, on the plus side of that, I am pleased that open science, I mean, within the UK system, open science will figure in the ref, which is our assessment procedure we have every 7 years now. And so, while it's not clear exactly what the ref will say about journal articles, if they need to be pre-registered with open data and have open science credentials, I look at the outputs from my own department in a ref capacity. And most of them are not really doing good open science. Now, if that's going to be required for the ref to get a top rating, a 4-star rating on your paper, people are going to have to change. But what that means is there will be jobs for people who are good at open science. That's important. That's why I'm saying that. So the ref, that's one way ref can do something for the good. Now, the early career researcher who had less publications, but had some registered reports and other things, and the ref is also making clear, we're not just taking the standard journal article as the one sort of output that's possible. Could be a program. Could be any sort of output that furthers science. That's what the ref is now saying they're going to look for. So that means that the people who decided they'll take a reputational hit, the early career researchers to do open science, could now be the ones that are going to be advantaged. Well, fingers crossed, anyway.
So my question was about like the beginning when you talked about theories, and I agree with you on the importance of having theories to them formulate hypotheses. But what I struggle with is finding theories that can help us to do that, because oftentimes theories are unspecified or they contradict each other, and then it's very hard, I guess, to work in a like informatory research framework where you have hypotheses, then you write this report. But the theories that kind of the foundation of our research are very, unspecified. So,
Yes, okay. So impartiality is one of the sort of values of science. You know, when you read a paper, you often get to the end of the introduction that says, we predict that. You know, I predict that. Blah, blah, blah. You might even think from reading some open science, that's what you should do. You should do a pre-registration. This is what I predict. Right. And you talked about contradictory theories. So how do you predict something? You've got contradictory theories. Well, the answer is it doesn't matter what you predict. It should not matter what you predict. The aim of science is not to confirm your genius in intuiting nature, right? So this is how I finish my introductions. There's something like this. Theory X predicts that, blah, blah, blah. Might also be, make it even more interesting. Theory Y predicts something different. Then what you're doing is you're testing the predictions of the theory, and then what happens is when you get your data, it either confirms, supports, or goes against different theories. Nothing about what I predict. That's not relevant. So the thing to think about is what are the different possible theories that could make these predictions? And if you can think of several, well, that's fantastic, particularly if they make different predictions. And then that's what you say at the end of your introduction.
Values publication with disability. Thank you for spending your money on a colleague. So make it very clear that the reproducibility statistician does not like check the stats, just reproducibility. Are you sure that the journals where you just like add the phrase that they also get this?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Yeah, no. So what we actually do is Rennie writes a report that she puts on its own OSF link. It's independent of the paper, so that she has control over what it is claimed that she is certifying. And that report says things like it has provisos in. This in no way is asserting that the statistics are the correct statistics for the situation, that the pre-registration was followed, and so on. So that's explicitly with sorry.
So you have that one sentence that you mentioned, plus it goes up.
Yeah, so what we say to the authors now, within the paper, you provide a link to this report. So then the report goes through in detail, and she came up with, this is just a small part of the template. She came up with a set of questions, and she goes through each of them and then writes. She could just say yes or no. She should do some writing, but it also has things like were the principles by which a given prediction would be asserted as confirmed or refuted made clear. In other words, is it made clear what you would do, for example, with a non-significant result? What are the principles by which you go from the statistics to your conclusions? So even that part of the process, she's saying, is it clear in the paper? Let's say you do a Bayes factor and you do a significance test. Have they made clear which one they're going through throughout the paper? So she's done a rather thorough job of this, and the report goes through everything with all the provisos in as well. Yes, that's right. So we make sure we have control over what it is that is certified by having our own OSF file of the outcome of her investigation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Todd. That was really the bee's knees. I would like you to address a worry in the following scenario. Imagine that there is a junior researcher working with a senior researcher, and the junior researcher has been contaminated by your ideas, and they now wish to perhaps start one of these peer community in journals or submit to one of those, or do some reviewing / editing for them.
Yes.
They are either collaborating with the senior person in the submission or seeking their advice, and the senior person expresses fear and loathing of novel ideas. Could you help this imaginary junior address, like, how would you help them address the worries of this senior?
What I'd wanted, it'd be useful to understand something of the precise fears and loathings of the senior researcher, because I think the process, we've designed it it sort of maximizes lots of things for the author that you can't get elsewhere. So, for example, what you can do, we put a lot of control with the author. The author can not just veto reviewers, they could veto editors as well. Because what we didn't want to have is like some there was a few of us in control of this process, and thereby gatekeepers for what goes through. We didn't want to set ourselves up as gatekeepers. So we wanted to make sure people could veto any one of us. You have control over, so that's more control than the journal will give you. You have control over which journal it goes to once you've been accepted through us. So as long as you're happy with one or more of the journals, of our friendly journals, you have control over which one that goes to afterwards. So the other thing the senior researcher should bear in mind is what you get out of this is the standard publication that they might want. But they also get more if they're interested in reputation. You could say, now look at the reputational. Now, if they're interested in sort of some sort of virtue signaling, you could say peer community in open science. You get what you want with the standard publications, but you've also got this being part of a process. Incidentally, was mentioned in the recent UK government report on how science should change in the UK. It explicitly singles out peer community in as a way forward. So, and as I say, we've got 70 and growing recommenders, increasing numbers of submissions. So to the extent that people, like to do what the Jonesies are doing, you can point that out to the senior researcher. Is there any point I've missed, do you think the senior researcher might object to?
I think those are all wonderful points. This is something that you probably can't address right here, right now.
No.
There's also a social aspect in that power dynamic that might make it difficult to address, but that's for another
yes
session.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Very much for your talk. I have a question on the theory testing part.
Mm.
If I understood correctly, you mentioned that we should consider what's the most general claim of the theory.
Yeah.
and we should test it. I was wondering, isn't the most general claim of the theory the one that's likely to overlap with other theories? And isn't it better if you want to disprove or confirm a theory to sort of focus on both surprising claim makes? And that's the most surprising claim of the theory.
Yeah, so there's a question of what makes a theory most sort of interesting or valuable or good. You know, is it sort of simplicity, generality, precision, and so on. Yeah, so there are a lot of virtues that a theory could have, but I think what I was reacting against is a sort of notion you come across where people think they must stick close to the data. And I think the difference is whether you think what you're doing in science is testing a theory or inductively building up a theory. And if you're inductively building up a theory, you never go beyond what the data says. The trouble is what the data says is something extremely boring. Fred did this and John did this and Mary did this. If you go beyond that, you've gone beyond the data already with some assumptions. But then your assumptions, okay, so we'll do statistical generalization, but then only applies strictly to the University of Sussex undergraduates, you know, the sample I randomly sampled from. If you think from the point of view of theory testing, you end up being able to say much more broad claims, which are actually the interesting claims that make up psychology, that enable us to understand the human mind. It's true if you've only tested University of Sussex students, we haven't fully tested that. But that doesn't stop us making the more general claim. It just now leaves open, there are other ways of testing it. Yeah, what about the students in Beijing? Yeah, if it's a general theory and it's passed by the University of Sussex students, we can still test it at the University of Beijing students. But what was interesting was a general theory, right? I don't need to restrict my theories just to what the data allow, as it were, or just to what you could inductively generalize given standard statistical assumptions. So in other words, I'm Popperian in that respect. I think we're in the business of severe theory testing, not inducing theories.
Thank you for the super inspiring talk. I was wondering, perhaps you said that, and I didn't really get it, what an example would be of such a small thing that university governance could give to many publics?
Yeah, so I didn't give an example, but okay, so for example, what we have, well, in the UK, what I suggested in my paper was, what will the university stance be on a pension debate that's happening? Okay, the VC could decide on the president of the VC could just decide on the university position that they're going to argue, or they could put it to a mini public. Or for example, our VC wants to change the structuring. What we have is a set of, psychology is its own, what we call a school. It's not part of a larger science faculty, for example. We go straight, it's very flat structure. We go straight from individual schools, virtually subjects, to senior management. She wants to introduce an intermediate faculty structure. Some people think her ideas are not so good. Other people think they're fine. Okay, she could just say what she wants to do and do it. But what goodwill would she get? I mean, she certainly would get if she said, we'll set up a citizens' assembly. I'll go with what you guys say. I'll make the best case I can. I'll let you study it. You can study the counter arguments. You come to the decision, we go with that. Then people would no longer have the feeling there's management, which is them. And then there's us. It's not us and them. It's just us. We make the decisions. Yeah.
A few seconds ago, you said that your position is that psychologists should be in advocate of inductive theory building.
No, theory testing. So against inductive theory building, in a sense. Of course, you've got to think up your theories, but then what we really why we want to do that is then to severely test them.
Earlier in your talk, you said something about there's always a role for natural history.
Yes,
I
yes.
wonder how you reconcile those positions. Who should be doing natural history?
Well, I'm not going to legislate on that. I mean, the problem is Maggie Bowden once said to Chris Frith. So Chris Frith is a big fMRI person. Maggie Bowden is a philosopher. She said, I think fMRI is about 70% natural history. Chris said, no, Maggie, you're wrong. Maggie, you're wrong. It's 90% natural history. So what I mean, is it just me? But when I read a paper where you have a rich data set and they throw a whole bunch of non-pre-registered statistics at it, with a pipeline with 100 different analytic decisions, that gives you about 40,000 different p-value maps. And then you just say, we had a poke around and we got these, you know, we got these bits of the brain going this way and these bits of the brain going that way. And here's a story we can spin about it. It's sort of, you could cast that as what they're trying to do is inductive or natural history. But I just see it all the time. And what I'd like to see is a pre-registration, a registered report, where they say, this theory makes this, and you can do it in fMRI, it's not that this can't be done. This theory makes this prediction. If this comes out, the prediction's wrong. And I think we would learn more that way. I mean, that's fundamentally the reason why I think we should do it is we'd learn more about what are the good theories, what are the bad theories, what are the ways we should think about the way the brain is working. Does that answer the question? They're not incompatible, no. So we do. So I guess what I'm saying is we do need some poking around, sure. But when the whole science, the whole field seems to be nothing but poking around, that's sort of what I'm reacting against. You can do the exploration in, I've forgotten the lead author of the paper, but you can do exploration sort of natural history in some more systematic ways than is typically done. For example, you take, well, this paper was a subliminal perception paper, where you just varied all the things that could be varied in these sorts of experiments. So you have thousands of different possible, you know, what is the font size, what are the timing parameters, and so on. And then each subject is a random point in that space, literally random. It's set up that you've defined the space in advance. And then that's sort of a systematic way of poking around, which I thought had something going for it. It's quite interesting. So I'm not saying poking around is a bad thing. But what I'd like to see it followed up with, I mean, sure have a poke around, but why don't you always, whenever you've done that, always follow it up with something like a registered report, or at least a pre-registered confirmatory test of some predictions. That's my gut reaction. Does that seem reasonable to you? Yeah.
There's one last question there, because at 7 we have to leave the building.
Yeah, thanks for this talk. And my question is actually related to this and related to the paper that Daniel Larkin's why hypothesis test showed that pure hypothesis. You're probably aware of it, but his argument is that often we're not ready to actually test that hypothesis because the measurement.
Yeah, so I read that paper, and I sort of had the opposite view to what's in that paper. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's the first task. So
Yeah.
we are at the stage so we can set up these tests.
Well, the thing is, I do myself. You know, and I sort of think if I'm going around testing theories, I just, and I do it in flaky disciplines like hypnosis and consciousness. I mean, why can't other people do it? I mean, when people say, and as an editor, I sometimes get this, I say, tell me your theory. And then I get the scientific context in which we're working is, and I say, no, tell me the theory that you're testing. And sometimes I can say, well, what about this theory? Doesn't this work? And oh, yeah, that works. So sometimes I think is people just aren't used to thinking this way. It's sort of a culture change. So as soon as you ask yourself the question, what is the broadest, most interesting claim that could be shown wrong? it's just, it's a simple Popperian question, but a lot of people just aren't used to asking that question. I think that's the problem. So I think we're completely ready for it. We're completely ready for theory testing.
What's the last question? I know it's gonna take some time to take you all out. Because otherwise we are gonna not.
I'll end the Zoom now, shall I? End the Zoom, right?
Yeah.
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 End web.